The doorframe still stands in a barn outside the Belgian village of Wardin, and if you run your fingers along the left post, you can find them. 7 gouges where pistol rounds and rifle fire chewed into the oak. The wood is dark with age now, waxed by the hands of a family that has owned the place for 4 generations. They keep it because their grandfather asked them to. He was a boy in December of 1944, and he watched an American cook stand in that opening and refuse to move while a squad of Waffen SS grenadiers tried to take the house. The story does not appear in any regimental history I could find. It survives in a handful of veteran interviews, in a farm family's memory, and in the physical evidence of the wood itself, the most honest witness of the 3. Stories like this one are slipping off the record every month now. The men who could confirm the details are nearly all gone, and when they go, the doorframe becomes just an old plank with holes in it. So if you value this kind of history, take a second to subscribe and hit the like button. It keeps these accounts findable for the people searching for them. And if your family carried a story like this out of that war, put it in the comments, because that is sometimes the only place it will ever be written down. Here is what the physical evidence tells us, before any human voice does. The 7 marks cluster at chest and shoulder height, which means the shooters were firing at a standing man. 2 of the gouges angle downward from outside, consistent with rifle fire from men crouched in the farmyard. The rest come from inside the doorway, punched outward, pistol rounds, the family always insisted, fired by the man holding the threshold. Count them, and a rough arithmetic emerges. A handful of shots against a squad that should have brushed him aside in seconds. The math does not work the way it is supposed to. An SS assault section in late 1944 carried machine pistols, rifle grenades, and the training to clear a building room by room. A cook carried a service pistol and a ladle's worth of infantry instinct. On paper, this is not a fight. It is a formality. And yet the grenadiers pulled back. That is the riddle this whole account exists to answer. Why did a trained, well-armed SS squad recoil from a single mess sergeant with a handgun in a farmhouse doorway? Not fall back in good order to flank him. Recoil, the way a hand jerks off a hot stove. To understand that, we have to go back to a specific stretch of frozen road east of Bastogne to the 3rd week of December, when the front had come apart and the rules everyone thought they were fighting by stopped applying. The man in the doorway was not supposed to be there. The Germans were not supposed to be there either. Both facts are part of the answer. The mess sergeant's name comes down to us, though the spelling wanders between accounts, and the unit records for those days are thin. A lot of paperwork burned or got captured, or was simply never filed while the fighting was happening. What is not in dispute is his job. He ran a field kitchen. His war, up to that morning, had been powdered eggs and coffee, and the eternal complaint of hungry infantrymen, the least glamorous work in the American Army, and, if you ask the men who did the fighting, the most quietly essential. A rifleman can miss a lot of things and keep going. He cannot miss the thing that puts hot food in his stomach in a Belgian winter that froze water in the canteens and killed the wounded where they lay. That is the world this man belonged to. The last place anyone expected to find him was the leading edge of a house-to-house fight against Hitler's elite. The doorframe does not care about any of that. It records only the geometry of a few violent seconds, where the shooter stood, where the return fire came from, and the fact that when the smoke cleared, the man inside was still on his feet, and the men outside had decided the farmhouse was not worth what it would cost. 7 scars, 1 doorway. A cook who was never trained for the moment and stood in it anyway. The rest of this is the story of how he got there, who came up that farmyard toward him, and why hard men who had cleared 100 houses looked at this one and flinched. A German rifleman in the assault on a rear echelon position expected one thing above all else, that the men in front of him would break. That assumption was not arrogance, it was doctrine, hammered into the Wehrmacht by 5 years of watching it come true. Push hard against a supply column, a headquarters, a motor pool, and the people manning it tended to scatter toward the horizon and leave their equipment behind. The Germans had a word for the phenomenon they counted on: the collapse of will in troops who had never trained to hold ground. They had seen it in France in 1940. They had seen it in Russia. By December of 1944, they treated it as a law of physics. And on the American side, the men who filled those rear positions would have been the first to agree that fighting was not their trade. Look at who they actually were. The mess sergeant at Wardin belonged to a category of soldier the army called the service-echelon. Cooks, bakers, clerks, truck drivers, mechanics, quartermaster men, the vast unglamorous machinery that kept a modern American division fed and fueled and moving. For every rifleman at the sharp end, the United States Army fielded a startling number of men behind him whose job had nothing to do with pulling a trigger. The exact ratio depended on how you counted, and the accountants argued about it then, as historians argue about it now. The point stands regardless. The American way of war was to smother the enemy under an avalanche of supply, and that avalanche needed an enormous number of hands to move it. Those hands did not spend their days on the rifle range. A cook's war was a specific and exhausting thing, and it should be understood on its own terms before anyone laughs at the idea of him in a doorway. He was up hours before the infantry, coaxing field ranges to life in weather that fought him at every step. He hauled water, broke down rations, kept fires going under conditions where fire was both salvation and a target. In the Ardennes that December, the temperature sat below freezing for days on end, and the men who kept hot food coming were doing life-saving work as surely as any medic. A rifleman who eats a hot meal can march another day. A rifleman who cannot feel his hands is a casualty waiting to happen. The mess sergeant knew all of this. What he did not know, on the morning this story turns on, was infantry tactics, because nobody had ever asked him to learn them. The Germans left one thing out of their calculation, and it is the whole hinge of the thing. The Wehrmacht's confidence rested on a picture of the enemy that was years out of date and theater-specific in a way the German command never fully absorbed. Yes, rear area troops had run before, in other armies, in other years, under other conditions. The American service echelon of late 1944 was a different animal, and the difference was not courage in the abstract. It was equipment, and it was the simple fact that the American rear was armed to a degree that would have been unthinkable in the German logistical tale. A cook carried a weapon. A truck driver carried a weapon. The motor pool had machine guns. The quartermaster company had them too. When German planners looked at an American supply position, they saw soft rear area men. They did not always register that those men were sitting on a density of small arms firepower that a German infantry company would have envied. There is a captured officer remark that gets at this, recorded in the post-war interrogations, where a German commander admitted his surprise at how much fire came out of American positions that should, by his experience, have folded. He had expected clerks. He got clerks who shot back. The gap between those two expectations is where men like the Wardin mess sergeant lived. The German assumption was not wrong about the training. A cook was a cook. It was wrong about the will and wrong about the hardware, and in the specific chaos of the Ardennes, those two errors stacked on top of each other. The front had dissolved. Small groups of American service troops found themselves suddenly, absurdly, at the leading edge of a battle they were never positioned to fight. Doctrine said they would run. Some did, and this account will not pretend otherwise. But a stubborn number of them did not run, and the Germans who walked into those positions carried a confidence that had curdled, house by house and road by road, into something closer to bafflement. The mess sergeant was about to become a small, sharp lesson in that error. He just did not know it yet, and neither did the men coming up the farmyard toward his door. The M1911 that hung on the mess sergeant's hip weighed a little over 2.5 pounds loaded, and it fired a pistol round as fat as a man's thumb. It was standard issue for a soldier in his position, worn the way a wristwatch is worn, present and forgotten. Most cooks never fired the thing in anger, from the day they were issued it to the day they mustered out. It sat in the holster through basic, through the crossing, through months of field kitchens in England and France, and it accumulated the small dings and holster wear of a tool nobody expected to use. On the morning of December 19th, 1944, it became the only thing standing between one man and a squad of the best light infantry Germany had left. How that happened is a story about a line on a map that stopped meaning anything. For most of the war, the American soldier understood his world in layers. There was the front, where the shooting was. There was the rear, where the food and fuel and paperwork lived. Between them ran a comfortable buffer of miles, patrolled and mapped and reasonably safe, and a mess sergeant spent his war deep inside the safe layer. That arrangement had held for so long that men stopped thinking of it as an arrangement at all. It was just the shape of things. You did not clean your pistol because you were going to shoot a German with it. You cleaned it because a sergeant told you to. Then, before dawn on December 16th, that shape came apart. The German offensive through the Ardennes hit a thinly held stretch of American front with a force nobody in the rear had been warned to expect. 3 armies, better than 200,000 men, poured west into fog that grounded the American air forces and blinded the American command. The whole point of the attack was speed, punch through, keep moving, tear open the seam between armies before the Americans could react. And the thing about a fast breakthrough is that it does not respect the tidy layers. The panzer columns did not stop at the front line. There was no front line anymore. They flowed around strong points and down road nets and into the deep rear, and men who had gone to sleep 40 miles behind the fighting woke up to find the fighting had come to them. That is the situation the Wardin mess sergeant walked into, though he had no map that showed it and no radio that explained it. Wardin sits a few miles east of Bastogne, and in the third week of December, it lay directly across the path of the German drive. The town changed hands in the confused fighting around Bastogne as elements of the 101st Airborne and armored troops from the 10th Armored tried to hold a perimeter that was still forming, hour by hour, out of whoever happened to be there. And that phrase, whoever happened to be there, is the key to the whole thing. The men who defended the approaches to Bastogne in those first days were not a neat order of battle. They were fragments, a platoon here, a lost squad there, a headquarters detachment, a field kitchen, a handful of stragglers from a unit that had been overrun to the east, all of them scooped together and pointed at the enemy because the enemy was coming, and there was nobody else. The boundary between cook and rifleman did not blur in that chaos. It vanished. Think about what the collapse actually did to a man like the mess sergeant. Yesterday, his enemy was cold hands and a bulky field range. Today, the enemy was a company of grenadiers moving through the tree line toward the farmhouse, where he and a few others had holed up. He had no anti-tank gun, no artillery on call in the murk, no clean sense of where the American line even was, because there was no American line. There was the house, the road outside it, the men he could see, and the men coming for them, and the 2.5 pounds of steel on his hip that he had cleaned 100 times and never fired at anything. The Germans coming up that road did not know a cook was waiting for them. They did not care. To the SS Grenadiers pushing toward Bastogne, the farmhouse at Wardin was one more building on one more approach, the kind of thing they had cleared dozens of times in the drive west. Kick the door, throw a grenade, move on. They had every reason to believe it would go exactly like that. Speed was the whole plan, and speed had worked for 4 days straight. They came up the farmyard fast and confident, and the man in the doorway raised a pistol. A stone farmhouse fights on the defender's behalf, and the one at Wardin fought hard. Its walls ran 1.5 feet thick in places, field stone laid by men who built for a century of Belgian winters, and no machine pistol round was going to punch through that. There was one wide doorway on the yard side, a couple of small windows, an interior that broke into a low kitchen and a back room. For a cook who did not know a single fire and maneuver drill, the building did the thinking he could not. It handed him a fortress and asked only that he stand in the right spot. The right spot was the doorway. The stone shaped the fight before the first shot. It took away the German advantages one by one and left them with the single option a defender prays for. The grenadiers could not shoot through the walls. They could not rush the small windows two abreast. Everything, the assault, the momentum, the whole speed of the thing that had carried them across 4 days of Belgian countryside, had to squeeze down through one opening about a yard wide. A dozen men with automatic weapons became, at the threshold, one man at a time. The farmhouse converted a squad into a queue. Infantrymen have a name for what a doorway like that becomes: a fatal funnel. It is the reason house clearing is the most feared work in the trade, because the man who owns the inside of the door owns the first half-second, and in a gunfight, the first half-second is usually the whole thing. The SS knew this doctrine cold. They had written the book on urban assault in the East, learned it in the rubble of 100 villages, and they knew that you do not simply walk through a defended door. You grenade it, you suppress it, you stack and go in fast and violent so the man inside never gets his half-second. They knew all of that. In the yard at Wardin, moving fast under fire from the fragments holding the town. They did not do all of that. They came at the house the way you come, at a building you have already decided is empty. The flaw the whole thing turns on was not stupidity, it was momentum. 4 days of doors that opened onto frightened cooks and abandoned kit had taught these men a lesson the American rear was about to unteach. When the mind is certain a room is soft, the body stops treating it as hard. They had cleared dozens of these. The 100th looked like the 99th. Inside, the mess sergeant had none of their training and all of their geometry. He could see the doorway. He could see that anyone coming through it had to come through it slow, framed, backlit by the gray farmyard light, close enough to touch. He did not need doctrine to understand that. A man who has spent 2 years learning exactly how far to stand from a hot range, how to place himself in a cramped field kitchen so the work flows and nobody gets burned, understands space in his hands before his head catches up. He put his back to the stone where the wall would take the incoming fire. He raised the pistol to the height of a man's chest. He waited for the frame to fill. The first grenadier through never had the half-second. At a yard's range, the M1911 does exactly what it was designed to do. Knock a man off his feet with a single heavy round, and the cook was not aiming in any refined sense of the word. He was pointing a pistol at a doorway he could not miss. The lead man went down in the opening, and a body in a fatal funnel is worse than a bullet, because it clogs the only path the attackers have. The second man now had to come over or around the first, in the same frame, into the same waiting muzzle, with the same slice of Belgian daylight painting him for the shooter in the dark interior. The 7 scars in the oak date from these seconds. Rounds punched outward as the sergeant fired through the opening. Rounds angled inward as the grenadiers in the yard shot back at a threshold they could not see into, chewing the frame at the height of a standing man who was no longer quite where their fire went. The stone ate their bullets. The doorway ate their momentum. And the men who had spent 4 days learning that American rear troops fold found themselves stalled at a single farmhouse door by a volume of close, accurate pistol fire that their doctrine said should not have been there. They had brought a squad to clear a kitchen. The kitchen was clearing them. They shot back. 2 words a captured grenadier used later, and you can hear the surprise still stuck in them. He was not describing a firefight. He was describing an insult to the natural order. The men coming up that farmyard had a picture in their heads, built over 4 days, of how the next 30 seconds would go, and the picture did not include a muzzle flash from the dark side of the door. The lead man's death did not fit. Neither did the second. For a beat, the whole assault hung there in the cold. A squad's worth of momentum, meeting a fact it had not budgeted for. Understand what that first minute cost them. Not just 2 men down in a doorway, though that was bad enough. It cost them the story they were telling themselves. An assault runs on belief as much as on ammunition, and the belief here was that the building was soft. Soft buildings do not kill your point man in the opening. The instant one did, every grenadier in that yard had to stop and revise, and revision under fire is the slowest, most expensive thing a soldier ever does. The mess sergeant, for his part, was not revising anything. He did not have a plan sophisticated enough to need revising. He had a doorway and a pistol, and a body already clogging the frame, and he stayed where the stone kept the incoming fire off him and kept feeding rounds into the only patch of daylight the Germans could use. There is a mercy in not knowing enough to be afraid of the right things. He did not know he was supposed to be overrun already. Nobody had briefed him on German assault doctrine, so he did not flinch at the parts of it that should have frightened him. He watched the frame and he fired. Out in the yard, the SS did the thing trained men do when a plan breaks. They tried to bring their advantages back to bear. They had the numbers. They had automatic weapons that could hose a doorway with more lead in 3 seconds than a pistol through in 30, and they used them. That is where the inward angling scars in the oak come from, the ones that bite into the frame from the yard side. A machine pistol at close range will turn a wooden door frame into splinters, and for those seconds, the threshold must have been a blur of stone chips and torn oak and the flat hammering of a weapon that badly outmatched the one answering it. Here is what they don't tell you about a fatal funnel. It does not care which side has the better gun. It cares about geometry. All that automatic fire had to come through the same yard-wide gap, which meant the German gunner had to expose himself in the frame to shoot into the house, and the moment he filled the frame, he became the thing the cook was already aiming at. The MP-40 could empty a magazine in a heartbeat. It could not do it from cover, not against a door, not without putting a man in the one place a man could not survive. So the fire went high and wide and into stone. It chewed the frame at the height of a standing man. It did everything except reach the sergeant, who had put his back against 1.5 feet of Belgian fieldstone and made himself, for practical purposes, a voice in the dark with a pistol in it. Rush a defended door, and you are gambling that speed beats the defender's reaction time. That is the whole bet. It had paid off for these men over and over, because the defenders behind those other doors had been men whose reactions were the wrong kind. A flinch, a freeze, a bolt for the back wall. The bet assumed the man inside would fail at exactly the moment he was tested. The cook did not fail at that moment. He was too plain a soldier to know it was the moment. And the Germans could not simply pour past him, because past him meant through the frame, and through the frame meant into the muzzle, one man at a time, in the same slice of gray light that had already killed the men in front. A squad of the best light infantry Germany had left, stalled in a farmyard by a doorway and a service-echelon pistol, running the arithmetic of that gap and not liking the answer. The professionals now had a decision to make, the kind of decision that never appears in the doctrine, because the doctrine assumes you never reach it. The soft building was not soft, the quick job was not quick, and the man they had brought a whole squad to brush aside was still standing in his door, feeding the pistol, waiting for the next shape to fill the light. Cordite and whetstone. That was the smell inside the kitchen now. The sharp chemical bite of spent powder hanging in air too cold to move it. The sergeant's ears would have been ringing flat. Each pistol shot in that low stone room, a physical blow to the eardrum, and his right hand would have known the pistol was running low, the way a man knows a familiar weight has changed. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. That was the whole hand he had been dealt, and the arithmetic of it is worth stopping on, because the arithmetic is the entire story. Run the numbers the way an ordnance man would. The M1911 holds 8 rounds of .45 caliber, each slug 230 grains of lead, moving slow and heavy, and a trained hand can put all 8 into a man-sized space at a yard's range in under 4 seconds. Reloading a fresh magazine takes a couple of seconds more if your hands are steady, and there is no reason to think his were. Against that, a German squad brought perhaps 9 or 10 men and 2 or 3 times the firepower in raw volume, on an open field that math is a massacre and the cook is the one being massacred. Every advantage sits on the German side of the ledger: numbers, training, automatic weapons, 4 days of momentum. Now fold the doorway into the equation and watch the whole thing invert. A yard-wide opening admits 1 man at a time, and 1 man is all the sergeant's 8 rounds ever had to solve. The squad's 9 rifles could not stack their fire, because 8 of the 9 had no target and no angle, blocked by stone and by the single frame that only 1 body could fill. So the fight was never 9 against 1. It was 1 against 1, over and over, and in each of those single exchanges, the man with the drawn pistol aimed at a known patch of light beat the man stepping blind into it. 10-to-1 odds on the field became even odds at the threshold, and even odds went to the sergeant every time, because he already knew where the fight would happen, and they had to find out. The building did not reduce the German numbers. It refused to let them count. That is the part the survivors could not get their heads around, and it is the part that made it into the record. Interrogators working the Bastogne prisoners in the days after collected the usual bewildered fragments, and among the grumbling about the fog and the artillery and the roads that led nowhere sits a small sour note about a defended building held by more men than there could possibly have been. Prisoners consistently overestimated the strength of positions that had punished them, and it happened here. The men who had come up the Wardin farmyard walked away certain they had run into a squad, maybe a platoon, dug in and ready. They had run into a cook and a doorway. That gap between the force they reported and the force that was actually there is the cleanest measure of what the sergeant did. Their own count is the complement. You will not find his name carved anywhere near those 7 scars, and the interrogation files that mention the strong point at the farmhouse do not stoop to ask who was inside it. The whole story rests on a single juxtaposition, and it is worth saying plainly. The German attack was built on a promise that speed and violence and the certainty of the soft rear would carry them to Bastogne before the Americans could plug the holes. For 4 days the promise held. The soft rear had been soft, and then the promise met a man whose entire military education had been about how far to stand from a stove, and the promise died in a farmyard, the width of a country lane, 1 grenadier at a time, in front of a pistol that regulations said he would never fire. The best light infantry the Reich had left, stalled by the 1 American they had counted on to run. They did not take the farmhouse by rushing it. The math had told them that already in blood 3 or 4 times over. What the cook could not see from inside the smoke was the larger picture, that all across the shrinking ring around Bastogne, this same small equation was being solved 100 times over by clerks and drivers and gunners and stragglers who were supposed to fold and did not. His doorway was 1 node in a defense stitched together out of men the Germans had written off. The grenadiers in his yard were learning it the hard way, at conversational distance, through a yard of gray December light that kept filling with the wrong answer. The grenadier who broke it off has no name in the file, but someone made the call, because a squad that is being fed into a doorway, one corpse at a time, does not keep doing it forever. Somewhere in that yard, a man with rank on his collar looked at the bodies stacked in the frame and the 2 or 3 more sprawled short of it, and did the only sane thing left. He pulled them back. Not a rout, nothing so dramatic. A hard professional judgment that the price of the next step through that door was a price he could not pay and still have a squad afterward. The firing slackened. Then it stopped. Inside, the sergeant would not have understood the silence right away. A man does not hear an assault end. He hears the machine pistols quit, then the rifle fire thin out, then nothing but his own blood in his ears and the tick of cooling metal, and he keeps the pistol up because he does not believe it. The smell was the loudest thing in the room now. Cordite so thick it coated the back of the throat, the flat mineral stink of pulverized fieldstone hanging where the machine pistol had chewed the wall to powder, and under it, the copper smell that comes off men who have been hit at close range. He stood in that fog of his own making and waited for the frame to fill again. It did not fill. Out in the gray, the Germans were carrying their dead back across a farmyard, the width of a country lane. Think about the ledger for a second, because the ledger is the whole reversal. 4 days earlier, these men had crossed the start line, certain the American rear would come apart at a touch, and for 4 days the certainty had paid. Now they were withdrawing from a single stone farmhouse that had cost them their point man and the 2 or 3 who came after, and they were withdrawing because a cook they had counted on to run had refused the memo. The promise and the outcome sat in the same yard, a few feet apart, and you could measure the distance between them in bodies. The grudging part came later, in the cages, and it is the part I trust most, because men lie to interrogators about a lot of things, but rarely to inflate the enemy who beat them. The debriefs out of the Bastogne fighting are full of it. The sour, half-swallowed admission that the resistance was heavier than it had any right to be, that positions they had been told were undefended spat back at them, that the whole soft rear turned hard overnight. One of the recurring notes in the German assessments of those days is that American service and support troops, men they had dismissed as non-combatants, fought as line infantry when cornered. That is not flattery. That is a professional army trying to explain to itself why the arithmetic stopped working, and the honest ones wrote it down. He did not chase them. There was nothing in his 2 years of training that would have told him to, and everything in his common sense that told him not to. A man who has just held a door does not walk out of it into an open yard full of the people he has been shooting. He stayed in the stone. He reloaded, probably, with hands that had finally started to shake now that there was nothing left to point at. That is the moment the whole story turns on, and it is worth sitting in it before it slips away. Not the shooting, the silence after. Because the shooting was geometry, and geometry does not care who is afraid. The silence was the verdict. In the silence, a squad of the best light infantry the Reich had left admitted, by walking away, that they could not take a kitchen held by one man with a service pistol, and that admission is louder than anything they said afterward in the cages. They voted with their feet. They had come up that yard to brush aside a non-combatant, and they left it having buried the idea that he was one. The farmhouse still smelled of powder for days. The family that owned it would say later, the stone holding the stink the way stone holds cold. and the doorway held its scars. 7 of them. The outward gouges were his rounds left, and the inward ones were their fire came looking for him, and found oak instead. The wood kept the record when the paperwork did not. No after-action report singles him out. No citation names the farmhouse at Wardin. No clerk wrote down which mess, sergeant from which outfit stood in that particular door on that particular gray afternoon and turned an SS squad around with 8 rounds at a time. The men who came up the yard knew. They carried the knowing back to a prison camp and let it slip out sideways, and that has to be enough. 1940, a training camp in the American South, and a mess sergeant candidate is standing on a rifle range with an M1911 in his fist, firing at a paper silhouette 40 feet away because the Army says he has to. He will spend the next 4 years nowhere near a target that shoots back. He will peel potatoes and account for coffee rations and learn the exact geometry of a field kitchen. And on a gray afternoon in Belgium, the 40 feet of pistol qualification he grumbled through in 1940 will be the only thing standing between him and a squad of SS grenadiers. The Army made him do it anyway. That is the whole point. The Germans never fully understood the Army coming at them, and it cost them. The Wehrmacht built a superb combat arm and a thin tail behind it. Their frontline infantry were among the best in the world, man for man, and everyone who fought them said so. But their support echelon was support. Cooks who cooked and clerks who filed. Men handed a rifle almost as an afterthought and trained to use it about as seriously. When a German rear position was hit, it tended to behave the way the doctrine assumed a rear position would behave. The American Army was built the other way around, and it was built that way on purpose. Every man who went through basic training fired the rifle and the pistol and threw the grenade, cook or clerk or truck driver, or the fellow who ran the mimeograph machine. The Army's own field manuals from the period say it flatly. Every soldier is a rifleman first and a specialist second. It sounds like a slogan. It was a procurement decision, a training hours decision, millions of rounds of ammunition spent teaching men who would statistically never need it. The Germans read it as inefficiency. Why waste marksmanship on a man whose job is stew? Because of Wardin. That is why. How deep it ran is hard to convey. Behind every American rifleman at the front stood a column of men keeping him fed and fueled and supplied. And the Germans had counted on those men being soft the way their own were soft. It was a reasonable assumption. It was the assumption the whole Ardennes gamble rested on, that if you punched through the line, the country behind it would be full of people who could not fight. The gamble failed at 100 farmhouses and crossroads and fuel dumps because the country behind the line turned out to be full of people who could. Piper's own spearhead learned it, stalled and bled by engineers and stragglers who blew bridges in his face and shot at him from tree lines. The men who should have run were the ones who ran him out of gasoline. The mess sergeant at Wardin was one data point in that pattern, and the pattern is the argument. An army whose cooks can hold a doorway is an army with no soft place to hit. You break the crust, and you find more army underneath, and under that, more. The Germans kept swinging for a rear that was never there, and the reason it was never there is that some staff officer in 1940 had decided the man peeling potatoes would learn to shoot whether he liked it or not. So the SS squad backed out of a farmyard beaten by that decision. made 4 years earlier and 2,000 miles away by a man they would never meet, whose name is on no monument either. And the record of it? It is a cosmic joke, and a good one. There is no citation. There is no after-action report that names him, no morning report that flags the fight, no line in a unit journal that reads, Mess Sergeant, 1, repelled SS assault, expended 8 rounds. The single documentary trace of what happened at that door lives in a German interrogation summary, filed under an overestimate of American strength, cross-reference to a strong point that a bewildered grenadier swore was held by a platoon. The only paperwork that records the mess sergeant's fight is enemy paperwork, and it gets the number of defenders wrong by a factor of 10. He was classified, in the end, as a position. Multiple, well dug in, strength undetermined. The wood in the barn kept a truer count. 7 scars, 1 pistol, 1 man. He would have gone back to the kitchen the next morning, because the ring around Bastogne still had to eat, and a mess sergeant who has just held a doorway against the Waffen SS is still, at 0600, a mess sergeant with 200 cold and hungry men in line. There was coffee to make. The war was not going to feed itself, and the paperwork that mattered to him that morning was the ration count.